The rain hammered against the glass walls of Steel Tower, turning the skyline of New York into a blur of gray and silver. Inside the top-floor office sat Ethan Steele, one of the youngest billionaires in America, a man whose name opened doors and closed hearts. His empire stretched across continents, tech, energy, finance, but not a single corner of his life felt alive. The mahogany desk in front of him lay a thin envelope. Letter handwritten, old-fashioned. He'd received hundreds like it. Over the years, pleas for help, proposals, charity requests. But this one carried a name he thought he'd buried long ago. Yeah, Brooks. He remembered her only as a gentle presence from another lifetime, a volunteer at the community kitchen where he'd once served meals in college. Before money and ambition swallowed him whole, they'd been close friends back then, perhaps more than friends in moments of vulnerability. When she told him she was pregnant, he'd been 23 and terrified. He denied everything, convinced she was mistaken, and walked away without looking back. He hadn't heard from her since. For years, that decision was a quiet ghost that trailed him through every deal, every award, every empty penthouse. He opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a short note written in soft, looping handwriting. Ethan, I'm not writing to ask for anything. I just thought you should know that our son, Daniel, turns 10 next week. He's a good boy, curious, kind, and brave. He has your eyes. The last line struck like a blade. He has your eyes, he read it again. And again. He could almost hear her voice in those words. The same calm strength she'd had when she'd stood in that rain-soaked street years ago, begging him to believe her. He hadn't. He'd turned away, pretending that success could silence guilt. Now, 10 years later, the illusion cracked. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He wandered through his glass mansion on the edge of the Hudson, its cold architecture reflecting his own emptiness. Photos of him with presidents and celebrities lined the hallway, but none showed a moment of genuine joy. He found himself staring at his reflection and whispering, what if she was telling the truth? The next morning, he called his private investigator. Within hours, he had an address, a modest brownstone in Harlem. Maya Brooks, elementary school teacher, one child, Daniel. He sat in his car outside her building for nearly an hour, watching mothers walk their kids to school, his heart pounding harder with every passing minute. When the door finally opened, he saw her. Maya looked older, yes, but not broken. She carried herself with quiet dignity, a simple blue dress and a tired smile. Walking beside her was a boy with curly hair and a backpack too big for his small shoulders. Ethan's breath caught. The boy turned his head for just a moment, and Ethan saw it. Those eyes, gray-green, flecked with amber just like his own. Something inside him shattered. He stepped out of the car before he could change his mind. Maya! She froze, the color draining from her face. 10 years had passed, and yet the sound of his voice brought every buried memory rushing back. Ethan, she said quietly, what are you doing here? He looked at her, then at the child beside her. I got your letter, his voice cracked. Is he mine? Maya looked down at the boy, then back at Ethan. You're 10 years late to ask that. The next minutes blurred. Daniel, sensing tension, tugged at his mother's sleeve. Mom, who's this man? She hesitated. Just someone I used to know, baby. Go inside. I'll be right there. When the door closed, silence filled the space between them. Ethan swallowed hard. I was wrong, he said. I was young, scared. Maya's voice rose, trembling with the pain of 10 years held back. You were rich, Ethan. You were powerful. You could have done the right thing. But you didn't. I begged you to believe me. He lowered his head. I know, and I can't change that. But please, let me see him. She crossed her arms. You don't get to just walk back into his life because your conscience woke up. I don't want to take him away, Ethan said. I just want to meet him once, please. Something in his eyes, desperation, maybe regret, made her pause. Against every instinct, she nodded. One meeting. At the park tomorrow? If he asks who you are, I'll tell him the truth. The next day, the sun painted Central Park in gold. Ethan waited on a bench, heart pounding like a drum. When Maya arrived with Daniel, time seemed to slow. The boy's laughter rang like music as he ran ahead chasing pigeons. Ethan smiled nervously. Hi, Daniel. Hi, the boy said politely, curious. Mom said you're an old friend? Something like that. They sat together, feeding ducks. Ethan listened as Daniel talked about school, his favorite books, the science project he'd built from recycled parts. The boy's curiosity, his spark. It all reminded Ethan of himself before greed dulled his wonder. When Daniel turned and grinned, sunlight caught his eyes. Ethan felt his throat close. He has my eyes. He looked at Maya, who was watching silently. Tears shimmered in her lashes. Does he know? Ethan whispered. She shook her head. Not yet. Ethan drew a shaky breath. Can I tell him? Maya hesitated. Only if you mean it. Only if you're ready to be his father, not just his guilt. He nodded slowly. I am. Ethan knelt before the boy. Daniel, he said softly, there's something important I want to tell you. The reason I came here is, I'm your father. The boy blinked, confused. Then he looked at his mother, who nodded gently. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly, why didn't you come before? Ethan's chest tightened. Because I was foolish. I was afraid. I thought success could fill a hole that only love could, and I was wrong. I've missed 10 years I'll never get back, but if you let me, I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Daniel looked at him for a long time, searching his face. Then, without warning, he stepped forward and hugged him. Ethan froze, then held on as tears finally broke free. I forgive you, Daniel whispered. From that day, Ethan changed. He didn't throw money at the problem. He showed up, at science fairs, at baseball games, at parent-teacher nights. The tabloids caught wind eventually. Billionaire seen at public school event with mystery child. He didn't care. Every Saturday became sacred. They built model rockets, watched old movies, burned pancakes together. Ethan began to see the world through his son's laughter. And for the first time since his own childhood, he prayed. One evening, he found Maya standing on the porch watching the sunset. You've given me a second chance, he said quietly. You gave it to yourself, she replied. Daniel didn't need a billionaire. He needed a father. Ethan smiled, humbled. I want to help, not just him, but others. I'm starting a foundation for single parents, for kids who deserve better. She looked at him for a long time, then nodded. Do it for the right reasons. Months later, cameras flashed as Ethan stood at the ribbon cutting of the Daniel Brooks Foundation, dedicated to helping children of absent parents find stability, mentorship, and hope. Beside him stood Maya and Daniel, their hands joined. When reporters asked why he'd chosen the name, Ethan answered simply, because he taught me that love doesn't check bank accounts. It checks hearts. The applause was thunderous, but Ethan barely heard it. He was watching his son, who was beaming with pride. Years passed. The foundation grew into a national movement. Ethan never reclaimed the cold solitude he once called success. Instead, he built homes, schools, scholarships. Every anniversary of their first meeting in Central Park, he and Maya would take Daniel back to feed the ducks. And each year, Ethan would whisper the same words. You saved me the moment I saw your eyes, because those eyes had forced him to see his reflection, not the billionaire on magazine covers, but the man he could still become. Epilogue. On the day Daniel graduated from college, Ethan sat in the front row, tears streaming as his son took the stage. When Daniel began his speech, his voice carried the same calm warmth as his mother's. My father once told me that wealth isn't measured in what you own, but in what you give back. He used to say that love is the only investment that never loses value. I believe him. The crowd rose in applause. Ethan stood, proud and humbled, knowing that the boy who had once been a stranger had become his greatest legacy. And in that moment, under the lights and cheers, he finally understood what true fortune meant. It wasn't money. It wasn't power. It was forgiveness. It was family. It was love that found its way home. After the ceremony, the sun dipped low, spilling golden light over the college courtyard. Families clustered for photos, laughter rising like music. Ethan stood a little apart, letting Daniel bask in the moment with his friends. He remembered the boy's first steps, his first scraped knee, his first science fair project that exploded in the kitchen. All the years he'd almost lost, and now this. A man standing tall, confident, kind. When Daniel turned and caught his gaze, he didn't see the billionaire the world once worshipped. He saw his father, The man who showed up, who changed, who learned how to love without fear. "Dad," Daniel called, crossing the lawn. "You didn't cry during my speech, did you?" Ethan chuckled, wiping at his eyes. "Only because your words hit harder than any business deal I've ever made." Daniel grinned. "Mom said you'd get emotional." Ethan's eyes softened. "She's always right." They looked up to see Maya walking toward them. Still radiant, those streaks of silver now framed her curls. She smiled, holding out a small velvet box. "What's this?" Ethan asked. "A gift," she said. "From both of us." Inside was a silver keychain, engraved with the Foundation's logo, two hands intertwined forming the shape of a heart. Beneath it were 6 simple words. "Love always finds its way back." Ethan swallowed hard. "You too," his voice faltered. "You've already given me everything." Daniel placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Not everything. There's still more work to do." That evening they drove to Harlem, the place where the story had begun years ago. The old brownstone had changed. The neighborhood had blossomed. Children played in the streets. Murals colored the walls. And on the corner stood a brand new community center, bearing a familiar name. The Lillian Grace House, a home for single mothers and children. Ethan's foundation had built it in memory of the 2 women who changed his life. Maya Brooks and Lily, his mother, the one who had raised him with love before he ever lost his way. Inside, the air was filled with laughter and the smell of fresh bread. Volunteers bustled around, helping families settle in. A little girl, no older than 5, ran up and tugged at Ethan's sleeve. "Mr. Steele, Mommy says you're the man who built our new home. Is that true?" Ethan knelt down, smiling. "No, sweetheart. I just helped. You built it. Because you're the reason we did all this." The girl giggled and hugged him before running off. Maya watched quietly. "You see," she said softly, "this is what second chances look like." Ethan nodded, voice thick. "I used to think redemption was something you had to earn. But it's not. It's something you live, every day in every choice." Later that night, after the families had gone to their rooms, the 3 of them stood in the courtyard. Strings of fairy lights glowed overhead and laughter drifted through open windows. Ethan turned to Maya. "You were right, you know. Back then when you told me love isn't about status or power, it's about presence." Maya smiled faintly. "And you proved that change isn't weakness. It's courage." For a moment, silence settled between them, comfortable, full of meaning. "Do you ever regret forgiving me?" Ethan asked quietly. She looked at him for a long time, her expression softening. "Forgiveness isn't about erasing pain. It's about choosing peace over bitterness. And peace is what Daniel deserved." He reached for her hand just for a moment. "Thank you for believing there was still something worth saving." A year later, the Daniel Brooks Foundation had expanded across the country, dozens of centers supporting families, offering education, food, and shelter. Ethan, once a symbol of wealth without warmth, had become something else entirely, a man whose name now stood for compassion. He spent less time in boardrooms, more in classrooms. He'd visit local centers unannounced, listening to mothers share stories of struggle and triumph. He'd help fix leaky roofs, paint walls, deliver meals. It wasn't charity, it was connection. One afternoon, while visiting a center in Chicago, a teenage boy approached him nervously. "Mr. Steele, sir?" "Yes, I just wanted to say, thank you. My mom and I were homeless last year. Because of your program, I'm back in school. I want to be an engineer one day." Ethan smiled. "That's incredible, son. And you'll get there. Just promise me something. What's that?" "When you make it, lift someone else the way you were lifted." "That's how this keeps going," the boy nodded. "I will." Ethan watched him walk away, tears stinging his eyes. That night, back at the hotel, Ethan sat by the window overlooking the city lights. He pulled a small, worn photograph from his wallet, one of Daniel at age 10, feeding ducks in Central Park. He whispered to himself, "That's the day I started living again." The door opened quietly. Maya stepped in. She had joined the board of the foundation now, traveling alongside him to oversee new projects. "Long day?" she asked. He nodded. "A good one." She poured them both tea. "You know, sometimes I think about that first letter I sent you. I didn't expect you to respond. I just wanted you to know your son existed." He smiled sadly. "That letter changed everything. If you hadn't written it, I'd still be lost in all this glass and gold. Maya sipped her tea. Then maybe we were both meant to learn something. You learned to love. I learned to forgive. He looked at her, truly looked at her. The woman who had once stood alone, raising a child he'd denied, and turned pain into strength. Maya, he said softly, I used to think love was something you fall into. Now I know it's something you build, brick by brick with every selfless act. She smiled. And you built something beautiful, 10 years later. The scene was different now. Daniel stood behind a podium addressing a hall full of graduates. He was no longer the boy chasing pigeons. He was a man, confident and kind, just as his mother had dreamed. Behind him, on a large banner, were the words, The Steelbrook Scholars Program, empowering tomorrow's leaders. He looked out at the crowd and spotted his parents sitting together in the front row. When I was a kid, he began, I thought my father's greatest accomplishment was his company. Later I realized it was his change. A hush fell over the room. My dad once denied my existence. But when he finally looked into my eyes, he saw more than himself. He saw a chance to be better. That moment didn't just give me a father. It gave the world a man who finally understood that real success isn't measured in millions, but in the lives you touch. Maya squeezed Ethan's hand as tears streamed down both their faces. So if you remember anything from this speech, Daniel continued, voice thick with emotion, let it be this. Love can't undo the past, but it can rewrite the future. The hall erupted in applause. Ethan stood, pride swelling in his chest, and whispered to Maya, He's everything I ever hoped to be. She smiled through her tears. He's both of us, the proof that grace can turn guilt into greatness. That evening, the family walked out into the courtyard as dusk painted the sky in hues of lavender and gold. Fireflies glimmered in the air. Daniel turned to his parents. Dad, I was thinking, maybe next summer we could open a new branch of the foundation. In Africa this time, for children who've never had a chance. Ethan's eyes lit with pride. Then that's what we'll do. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. You're the best decision I ever made long before I even knew it. Daniel smiled. And you're the proof that no one's ever too lost to find their way back. They stood together beneath the wide sky. A family stitched together not by perfection, but by forgiveness. And somewhere between the stars and the city lights, the echoes of a long-ago mistake had finally turned into something pure, something eternal. Love had won. Years passed. The world changed. Technology advanced. Cities grew taller and fortunes shifted. But the lessons that had rebuilt Ethan Steele's heart never faded. He had stepped away from the empire he once ruled. The company, now run by Daniel, had transformed into something entirely new, a beacon for social innovation. The same steel and glass towers that once symbolized greed were now centers of sustainability, education, and opportunity. And yet Ethan never lost the humility that came with knowing how easily he could have lost it all. The old mansion. One gray autumn morning, Ethan returned to the mansion where everything had begun, the home that had once been cold, echoing and lifeless. Now the air smelled of baked bread and fresh flowers. The staff smiled easily. The walls, once heavy with silence, were adorned with photos. Children from around the world, families helped by the foundation, volunteers laughing under banners that read, Love builds homes. In the center of the great hall stood a portrait, one that stopped him in his tracks every time. It was a painting of a young black woman, holding a baby close to her chest. Her eyes, full of grace and courage, seemed alive. At the bottom of the frame were the words, For Maya, who taught the world that forgiveness is strength. He smiled softly. Maya had passed 2 years ago, peacefully surrounded by family. Her absence still ached, but her presence never left him. Every foundation event, every scholarship, every meal served in her name was another heartbeat of her legacy. Ethan ran his fingers along the edge of the frame and whispered, You were right, Maya. Love really does outlive regret. Daniel's visit later that evening. Daniel arrived, tall and confident, his suit slightly wrinkled from travel. Dad, he said, pulling him into a hug. The board meeting went great. We're launching 3 new centers next month. Ethan chuckled. You're doing more than I ever dreamed of. Daniel shrugged. I had good teachers. They sat by the fireplace, the crackle of wood filling the space between their words. After a long pause, Ethan asked quietly, "Do you ever think about how different life could have been?" Daniel smiled faintly. "All the time. But I don't dwell on the what-ifs. I focus on the what-nows. That's what you and Mom taught me." Ethan nodded, pride welling in his chest. "You've become everything I wasn't, and everything I hoped to be." Daniel's gaze softened. "You became it too, Dad. You just took the longer road." They shared a quiet laugh. A letter from the past later that night. While sorting through old boxes in his study, Ethan found a small yellowed envelope. The handwriting on it stopped him cold. Maya Brooks at 25 years ago. Hands trembling, he opened it. Inside was a letter he had never read. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means you finally chose to face what you once ran from. I don't hate you. I never did. I just wanted you to know that the child you denied isn't a mistake. He's a miracle. Maybe one day you'll see that too. And when you do, I hope you'll forgive yourself as easily as I forgave you, because the world needs your heart. If they need not your money, love always finds its way back." Maya tears blurred his vision. He pressed the letter to his chest and whispered, "You were right. Maya, you always were." The garden of names the next morning. Ethan walked to the garden behind the mansion, the same one where Lily and Grace's plaque had been placed years before. Now, there were dozens more plaques lining the pathway, names of women, men, and children whose lives had been touched by the foundation. At the center of the garden, a new marble statue stood tall, a woman holding a child aloft toward the sky. Beneath it were engraved the words, "For every mother who chose love when the world chose judgment." Ethan stood in silence, the morning breeze brushing through the leaves. He closed his eyes, feeling peace for the first time in a long time. Then he heard a small voice behind him. "Grandpa?" He turned, and there she was, a little girl, no more than 6, with curls like Maya's and eyes that mirrored his own. "Grandpa," she said again, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Mommy said we should leave these for Grandma Maya." Ethan knelt down, his heart trembling with tenderness. "That's very kind of you, sweetie." She smiled wide. "Grandma said love doesn't die. It just moves into new hearts." He felt tears sting his eyes. She was right about that too. Together they placed the flowers at the base of the statue. The little girl took his hand, her small fingers curling into his weathered palm. The legacy years later, when Ethan passed, the world mourned him not as a billionaire but as a man who had redeemed himself through compassion. At his memorial, Daniel spoke once more, his voice steady and full of love. "My father's greatest gift wasn't his wealth. It was his change. He taught me that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it gives us a future worth living." The audience wept as Daniel lifted a hand toward the foundation's emblem displayed on the screen. The same intertwined hands, the heart, the same words his parents had once shared. Love always finds its way back. Final scene years after that, Daniel's daughter, the little girl from the garden, stood where her grandfather once had. She was grown now, wearing a graduation gown, addressing a crowd of young scholars at the newest Lily and Grace Learning Center. Behind her hung a massive banner. "From one act of forgiveness, 1,000 futures bloomed." She smiled and said softly, "My grandfather made mistakes. My grandmother showed him mercy." Together they proved that the hardest stories can still have beautiful endings. "And if you take anything from their lives," she continued, "let it be this. No heart is too broken to heal. No past is too heavy to forgive. And no life is too lost to be rewritten with love." The audience rose to their feet, clapping, some crying, all moved by a truth as timeless as it was simple. As she stepped down from the stage, she looked toward the garden beyond the windows, where sunlight fell on 2 intertwined plaques. For Ethan and Maya, proof that love, once found, never truly dies. She smiled through her tears and whispered, "You did it, Grandpa. You kept your promise." The wind rustled through the trees as if answering back, soft, warm, and full of peace. Epilogue. And so it was that a story born in denial ended in devotion. A mistake became a mission, and a single pair of eyes, once filled with pain, became the mirror of grace that changed a man, a family, and a world. Because love, when it is real, does not fade, it forgives. It rebuilds and it lives on, generation after generation.